We are moving on with the online talk of Daniel Christian Wahl. He's the author of Designing Regenerative Culture, and his work, he works internationally as a consultant and educator in regenerative development, whole systems design, and transformative innovation. Daniel holds degrees in biology, but also holistic science, and he has been directing the Feinhorn College for 3 years. He's also a member of the International Futures Forum since 2009 and Gaia Education since 2007. Daniel has collaborated with UNITAR and UNESCO, many large NGOs in the world, and as a consultant, his clients included companies such as Camber, Luce, as well as local and regional governments and UK Foresight. Daniel today will be driving us deep into regenerative design. Thank you for connecting, Daniel, and please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me and for organizing this fascinating conference. I wish I had the time to be at every session. And I'm not going to use a PowerPoint because these virtual talks I find work better without talking over slides. But I would like to reflect a little bit that about 20 years ago, I was studying at Schumacher College in a master's in holistic science, and I met a man called David Orr, who's a design educator in the US. And David then said to me that we need to, the problem of how to fit a species arrogant enough to call itself Homo sapiens onto a planet with a biosphere is a design problem. That's a quote from David Orr. And he said we need to radically spread through design schools and culturally this notion that we have to design a sustainable civilization. And since then, I've spent 20 years looking at how we might do this. And I did a PhD in 2006 entitled Design for Human and Planetary Health, a holistic integral approach to complexity and sustainability. And you can already see that I used the word sustainability, but I focused on health. Because sustainability doesn't necessarily tell us what we're trying to sustain. And what we're actually trying to sustain in true sustainability work is the pattern that connects, that underlies the health and wholeness of life as a planetary process and how we fit into that process. And once we focus less on individuals and species and we focus on the planetary dynamics of how life over 3.8 billion years has created conditions conducive to life, then we can understand that actually life itself is structured as a nested scale linking, as Feifei said, jumping scales is really important in design. We need to understand the scale linking patterns of how life has created conditions conducive to life. And that means paying attention to the scale at which we design, local, bioregional, national, global, product design, or even earlier than that, material, which materials we're using. And try to always ask the question, how does our design actually affect the systemic health of the systems we're interfering with, whether it's human beings, communities, ecosystems, or the biosphere. So this, back then in 2006 in my PhD work, I suggested we need a Hippocratic oath for designers, do no harm. Let's practice design as a health generating, a salutogenic discipline. And if we're looking at another aspect of design, which is actually before design manifests into products and outcomes, designs, physical objects or processes, is to look at design as something that influences worldview and cultural narrative. And that includes even the subtitle of this conference, Design with Nature. To tease this apart from a linguistic framing perspective, if we have design with nature or learn from nature, even more like the Biomimicry Institute very often uses we are learning from nature, that from others' nature and make continues a meta design, a worldview that somehow has crept in over the last 5,000 years, and particularly over the last 250 years, that suggests that culture is different from nature. And even when we look at trying to design responsive cities, it really challenges us to question, is a city something that isn't nature, or what? Is there anything that isn't nature? The scientist and poet and artist Wolfgang von Goethe in Germany almost 200 years ago, at the beginning of our escapade into science and technology, realized that we were losing our perspective on what nature actually is, which is that larger all-containing process. And so he wrote back then, who doesn't see nature everywhere sees her nowhere in the right light. So maybe if we call a conference like this with a subtitle, Design as Nature, it would startle people because they would say, well, what does that mean? But it's inviting us to reintegrate into the family of life and say, how do we design as living beings conditions conducive to life? And for me, this is the bridge to regenerative cultures. Like, luckily, since my book came out in 2016, a lot of people have started to talk about how do we create regenerative cultures that are place-sourced and healing to local ecosystems. But very often, also the whole conversation about regenerative right now is as if it is the new kid on the block, the next thing after circular or smart or sustainable or integrable or whatever was fashionable just before. But regenerative is something much deeper. Regenerative is actually reconnecting to that patterning of life itself. So it is designing as nature with nature, redesigning ourselves back into the system. And it's understanding that the focus is not necessarily the outcome, the solution, the final physical design. It is building capacity in the system to continue to evolve. It's a shift towards outcome focus and final making it to that sustainable future or that regenerative culture, and understanding from the beginning that the best thing we can ever do is to continue our journeying and to continue living the questions of how we might be more regenerative, how we might heal local communities, local ecosystems, local economies, or regional economies, regional ecosystems. And in that process of shifting more towards the capacity of individuals and the collective to journey and to manifest their unique individual collective potential and the potential that is inherent in the local place and culture, we also shift away from the solutioneering of problem solving, which at the minute we have a problem solving mindset, and design unfortunately plays into this too often, that we are the problem solvers. You try to abstract the problem and then to define it even in more and more detail, and then to find a solution that you then can implement and scale out in any system. And through the process of abstraction, it loses the fit and the fittingness to local place and culture. But if we turn it around and we take the focus of our solutions as temporary learning opportunities to be at the local and regional scale, then we can work from manifesting potential. We can look at the unique collection of individuals and the collective, plus the uniqueness of the local culture and the local place. The story of place itself, like the minute we don't think we're separate from nature anymore, we can also have other ways of knowing that access what the land is asking us to do. And ultimately, this is grounding back in, I'm getting towards the end now, it is grounding us back in the understanding that our species' inheritance has been to be regenerative cultures. We have, for 99% of our history, lived bioregionally focused as custodians of the ecosystems we inhabited. And around the world, all indigenous cultures agree on how to do this carefully. And even up to this date, 80% of the biodiversity hotspots on the planet are within indigenous territories and should be under indigenous management. very often they're not, but still, because they're in indigenous territory and there is indigenous management there, that's why the biodiversity has been preserved. So we now are challenged to bring the best of science and technology through design as the nexus, the integration of all the disciplines and the integration from theory into practice. And at the same time use design as the nexus of bringing ancient wisdom of how to live appropriately in place that is present in indigenous cultures into the 21st century and apply it locally in a place-forced way. And that ultimately, to my mind, would be true designing with nature as nature. I've written a number of articles on my Medium blog talking about this notion of what salutogenic and bioregionally regenerative cities could be. And one of the key switch about when we work with what does regenerative have to offer for this, that's the wrong question. The question should be, how can we use our cities as drivers of bioregional regeneration and the regeneration of planetary health? And then suddenly it shifts, because we're not looking at the city as something that needs to be designed somehow only in a global context and within the context of climate change. No, we're looking at the city as how would we bring the circular economy home and make the city the driver of innovation around bioregionally focused regional production for regional consumption, creating new innovation in industries with all the wonderful technologies and insights that are presented in this conference, but focus them on creating truly regionally regenerative systems. Because if we heal our regions and if we heal our places, then by default, we will contribute to planetary healing. And of course, we need to do so as cosmopolitan bioregionalists in global collaboration and exchange, but understanding that it's not about best practice examples that then need to be copy-pasted, but it's about learning between regions in a subtle way where you say, okay, maybe this is the same climate zone and the same ecosystem, so maybe this solution could be applied in a similar ecosystem. But you always have to do it in a way that is sensitive to the uniqueness of local culture, local ecosystems, and place itself. And yeah, I think I'd rather continue with a lovely conversation for the panel, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.